I was 7 the first time my father called me a liar, and no one in that room questioned him. I had just spilled a glass of juice at my aunt's birthday dinner. I said, "It was an accident," before anyone even asked. He didn't look at me. He looked at the table and said, "She always says that. Nothing is ever her fault." A couple people laughed, and that settled it. No one asked me what happened. A week later, it happened again. Almost the same way. A girl at school said I took her pen. I hadn't. I explained everything where I'd been and who I was with. I remember looking at my teacher waiting for her to ask me. She didn't. When my parents came in, my father didn't ask either. He just said, "If she's denying it, she probably did it." Different place. Nothing changed. After that, I stopped correcting people. In class, I started preparing answers before I was even called on. In group work, if something went wrong, I stepped in first. It ended faster that way. I just stopped expecting anyone to check. At some point, I stopped asking myself if I was right. By high school, people described me with one word: easy. Easy meant no arguments, no corrections, just no friction. Then I met Callum. The first time we talked, he didn't interrupt even when I paused mid-sentence like I was expecting to be. I said something small, nothing important. He just nodded and said, "Okay." That should felt normal. It didn't feel familiar. There were parts of my past I didn't bring up right away, not because I was hiding anything. I just didn't know how to say it without it becoming something else. I thought leaving it alone would be enough. Time doesn't change a story someone else is already telling about you. And for a second, I was back in that room, waiting to be shut down, because 2 weeks before our wedding, my parents sat down with him and told him I had been pregnant, had a child, and left it behind without ever telling him. What do you say when someone you trust looks at you differently for the first time and you know it didn't start with you? Callum didn't accuse me. That's what made it worse. He called me in the middle of the afternoon. His voice wasn't angry. It was careful, like he was trying not to break something just by saying it out loud. He said my parents had come to his office. They hadn't told me. They hadn't called. They just showed up, sat across from him, and started talking. He didn't repeat everything right away. There was a pause first, long enough that I could feel something was off. Then he said, "They told me something about your past, and I need you to tell me if it's true. Not what, not how, just if." I was sitting in my car in a parking garage when he said it, engine off, phone in my hand. I remember staring at the concrete wall in front of me like it might explain something. I asked him what they told him. Another pause. Then he said it. "They said you had a child, and you gave it away." Just like that. No build-up, no hesitation. Like it was already a fact he was trying to work around. For a second, I didn't even react. It wasn't just the accusation. It was how familiar it felt. That same shift, that same quiet moment where something about me gets decided in another room and I walk in too late to change it. I asked him if he believed it. He didn't answer right away, and that silence told me more than anything he could have said. Not that he believed it completely, but that he couldn't ignore it either. And that was enough, because doubt doesn't need certainty. It just needs space. I tried to explain, but I could hear it happening again, even as I spoke. The careful tone, the measured questions, the way every word I said sounded like it was being weighed instead of heard. Not dismissed, just not trusted yet. And I understood why. Because what my parents told him wasn't random. It was specific, detailed, close enough to something real that it didn't sound made up. That's what made it dangerous, because there was a version of that story that was true, just not the way they told it. And sitting there in that car, holding my phone, realizing I had to explain something I had buried for years, I knew this wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was a line. And depending on what he believed when it was over, I was either about to marry him or lose him for something that never even happened the way they said it did. How do you explain something you never planned to say out loud without it sounding like you're trying to fix the story? I told him to come over. Not later, Not after work, right then. I didn't trust a phone call for something like this. I didn't trust pauses or silence or the way things can get misunderstood when you can't see someone's face. When he walked in, he didn't sit right away. He stayed near the door for a second like he wasn't sure what version of me he was about to meet. That hurt more than anything he had said. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. No distractions, no noise. Just that space between us that hadn't been there before. I didn't ease into it. I just said it. When I was 22, I got pregnant. He didn't react, not immediately. He just nodded once, like he was bracing himself to listen. So I kept going. I told him about the man I was with back then. Older. Confident in a way that felt steady at first until it didn't. The kind of person who makes decisions sound reasonable until you realize you're the only one adjusting. I told him how I found out, how I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the test like it belonged to someone else, how I didn't tell anyone right away, not even my parents, and when I finally did, everything got louder. Questions, opinions, pressure, not about how I felt, about what I was going to do. I told him I didn't know, and that was the problem. Because uncertainty doesn't sit well with people who want control. The person I was with didn't want the child. He didn't say it gently. He made it sound like something that needed to be handled, removed, closed. And every time I hesitated, he made it feel smaller, less real, like I was overcomplicating something simple. I remember one night sitting in my car, hands on the steering wheel, trying to decide what I wanted, and realizing I couldn't hear my own thoughts over everything everyone else expected from me. I was 4 months in when it ended. There was no decision, no choice, just a hospital room and a doctor explaining something I wasn't ready to hear. I lost the pregnancy. That was the truth. No birth, no child, no moment where I walked away from anything. Just something that was there and then suddenly wasn't. And a kind of quiet that comes after that people don't really know how to talk about. I didn't tell many people. Not because I was hiding it. I just didn't know how to carry it in a conversation without it turning into something heavy, something that needed a reaction I didn't want to manage. So I left it where it was, in the past. I finished speaking and looked at him. Really looked this time. He hadn't moved much. His hands were still on the table, his expression steady but different. Not cold, just processing. He reached across the table and took my hand, and the first thing he said wasn't a question. It was, "I'm sorry you went through that," and for a moment, that felt like enough, but I could still feel it sitting there. Not the truth I had told him, the version he had heard first. Because once something like that gets in, it doesn't just disappear. And I knew, even sitting there with his hand in mine, this wasn't over, not with him. And definitely not with my parents who had told that story like they expected it to stick. What do you do when someone believes you but not completely? Callum didn't pull his hand away. He stayed right there across from me, fingers wrapped around mine, like he meant what he said. And I believed him when he said he was sorry. But there's a difference between compassion and certainty, and I could feel that space between them. He didn't question my story. He didn't challenge it. But he didn't fully settle into it either. There were small things. The way he went quiet a second longer than usual. Have you ever had something from your past brought up in a way that doesn't even sound like your life anymore? That call didn't end quickly. It just slowed down. Callum didn't interrupt me, didn't accuse me. He just waited. And somehow, that made it harder. Because I knew exactly what he had been told. Not the truth. A version of it, twisted just enough to change how it sounded. "There's nothing like that," I said. And then I stopped. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I didn't know how to explain something I had barely said out loud before. There was something in my past, but it wasn't what they made it sound like. Years ago, I went through something difficult, something personal, something I didn't fully understand at the time and honestly, didn't talk about much after. Not because I was ashamed, but because every time I tried to explain it, it felt like it turned into something else in people's minds. And that's exactly what had just happened again. Callum stayed quiet on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Okay, just tell me what you want me to know. No pressure, no assumptions, just space." So I told him. Not every detail, not all at once, but enough for him to understand that what he'd heard wasn't the truth. And when I finished, he didn't question me. He didn't hesitate. He just said, "I'm sorry you went through that." And for a second, everything felt steady again. Like maybe this wouldn't become something bigger. Like maybe it would just pass. But the thing about something like this is it doesn't disappear just because someone believes you. Because once a story is out there, it doesn't stay quiet. And what I didn't realize yet was that this wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning of something that was about to show up in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. Have you ever walked into a room that looked perfect and still felt like something was off? That's what the rehearsal dinner felt like. Everything was exactly how we planned it. Soft lighting, long tables, people talking in low, easy conversations, the kind of setting that's supposed to feel warm, like a pause before something important. Callum was near the bar with his brother, laughing at something. He looked relaxed, normal. Every few minutes, his eyes found mine across the room. That part hadn't changed, and for a second, I let myself believe maybe nothing had. Maybe the last 2 weeks would just fade into the background. Maybe whatever my parents tried to do didn't land the way they expected. I wanted that to be true. I really did. My parents were already there, sitting at the far end of the table like they belonged exactly where they were. My father had a drink in his hand. My mother was smiling, polite, composed, the version of her most people saw. If you didn't know her, you'd think she was kind. If you didn't know them, you'd think everything was fine. They had called me twice after speaking to Callum. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I knew it wouldn't matter. And standing there, watching them act like nothing had happened, I realized something that sat heavier than I expected. They weren't worried. They weren't unsure. They were waiting. Waiting to see what would happen next. Waiting to see if what they said had done enough. That thought stayed with me as the night went on. People gave speeches, laughed, told stories about us, the kind of moments that are supposed to feel light, easy, meaningful. And I moved through it like I was supposed to, smiling when I needed to, listening when people spoke, answering questions without thinking too much about them. But underneath all of that, I was paying attention to Callum, to the way he responded, the way he looked at me when certain topics came up, the way he paused, just slightly, before answering anything that touched the past. It was small, subtle, but it was there. And once you notice something like that, you can't unsee it. I told myself to let it go, to trust what we had built, to not let doubt, someone else's doubt, turn into something bigger than it needed to be. And for most of the night, I held on to that, until the moment everything shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just the sound of a door opening behind me, and something about it made the entire room feel different. Have you ever felt a room change before you even knew why? I turned toward the door. At first, nothing about it made sense. People don't usually walk into a private dinner unannounced. Not like that. Not without someone reacting right away. But no one did. There was just this brief pause, conversations slowing, heads turning, like everyone was trying to place what they were seeing. And then I recognized her, Nora. I hadn't seen her in years. Not since that part of my life I didn't talk about anymore. The part connected to everything I had just explained to Callum days before. She looked almost the same, a little older maybe, more settled. The kind of stillness that comes from having gone through something and made it out the other side. But what stood out wasn't how she looked. It was the way she walked in, direct, focused, like she wasn't there by accident. She didn't stop to greet anyone, didn't hesitate or look around like she was unsure. She walked straight toward me, and that's when I noticed what she was holding. A plain manila envelope, nothing about it looked important, but the way she held it, steady, careful, made it feel like it was. She stopped in front of me. Didn't smile. Didn't try to soften it. She just said my name. Juliet. Not loud, not urgent, but serious enough that everything else in the room felt like background noise. For a second, I didn't move. Because there are moments when your mind tries to catch up to something your instincts already understand. And mine was already telling me this wasn't random. I asked her what she was doing there. She didn't answer that. She just said, "I need 5 minutes, somewhere private." And then she held out the envelope, not pushing it into my hands, just offering it, like she knew I would take it. I glanced past her for a second. Callum was watching. So were a few other people. My parents hadn't moved. They were still sitting at the table, but my mother's expression had changed. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but I did. Because I had spent years learning the difference between how she looked and what she was thinking, and in that moment, she didn't look composed anymore. She looked tense. That was enough. I took the envelope, didn't open it, not yet. I just nodded once and followed Nora out of the room. The door closed behind us, and just like that, the noise disappeared. It was quiet in the hallway. Too quiet. And whatever was inside that envelope was about to decide whether everything my parents said would hold or fall apart completely. Have you ever held something in your hands and known it was going to change everything before you even looked at it? That's what that envelope felt like. We stood in the hallway just outside the dining room. The noise from inside was muffled now, distant like it belonged to a different moment. Nora didn't rush me. She just watched, like she already knew what was in there and what it would do. I looked down at it for a second longer than I needed to. Then I opened it. The first thing I saw was a set of hospital records, my name at the top. Dates I recognized immediately. I didn't have to read every line to know what they were. But I did anyway, slowly, line by line, because this wasn't just about remembering anymore. This was proof, medical notes, a discharge summary, a signed statement from the attending physician. Clear, clinical, impossible to misread, pregnancy loss, 17 weeks, no ambiguity, no room to twist it into something else. I swallowed and flipped to the next pages. That's when it shifted. Printed screenshots. Text messages. I recognized the names before I even finished focusing on the words, my mother, and Sebastian, the man I had been with back then. The conversation wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. My mother had reached out to him first, asked him, clearly, directly, if anyone ever asked, could he confirm that I had given birth to a child and placed it for adoption? I read that line twice, then a third time. Just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it, Sebastian's response came a few minutes later, short, firm. He said that wasn't what happened, that he wanted no part in anything like that. There were 2 more messages from my mother after that. Pushing, trying again, he didn't respond, and that was the end of it. I stood there holding those pages, feeling something settle in a way it never had before, because this wasn't suspicion. It wasn't a feeling. It wasn't something I had to explain or defend. This was clear, deliberate, planned. They hadn't just said something in the moment. They had tried to build it, piece by piece, and when they couldn't get confirmation, they said it anyway. I looked up at Nora. She didn't say anything right away, just gave me a small nod, like she understood exactly where my head was. I asked her how she got this. She told me Sebastian had reached out to her after my mother contacted him, said something about it didn't sit right with him. They had stayed loosely in touch over the years. When he told her what my mother asked, she knew she had to tell me. So she got the records, drove here, walked into that room, because she knew I wouldn't have them otherwise. I looked back down at the pages in my hands, and for the first time since all of this started, I wasn't trying to explain anything. I wasn't trying to fix anything. I wasn't trying to get ahead of someone else's version of me. I was just standing there with the truth, And for a moment, everything felt very still, very clear, because now it wasn't about whether Callum would believe me. It was about what happens when the people who lied have nowhere left to stand. I closed the envelope, took a breath, and turned back toward the door, knowing the next few minutes were going to change more than just one conversation. Have you ever walked back into a room, knowing you're not the same person who walked out? I stood there for a second with my hand on the door. The envelope felt heavier now, not because of what was inside, but because of what it meant. Nora didn't say anything as I reached for the handle. She didn't need to. She had already done what she came to do. I pushed the door open. The noise came back first, voices, glasses, low conversation, but it didn't feel the same anymore. It felt distant, like I was stepping into something I could already see through. A few people turned. Callum did too. He read my face immediately. I could see it in the way his expression shifted. Not panic, not confusion, just attention. Focus. He stepped away from the bar and came toward me without saying anything. I didn't stop him, but I didn't explain either. Not yet. I walked past him, straight to the table, straight to my parents. The room started to quiet down, not all at once, but enough that people were noticing something was off. My father looked up first, calm, almost bored. My mother followed a second later, that same composed expression, but it didn't hold this time. Not completely. I placed the envelope on the table in front of them. Not hard, not dramatic. Just enough to make it clear it was meant for them. Neither of them touched it. I rested my hand on top of it for a second, then looked directly at my mother. "You went to him," I said. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me more than anything. She didn't answer right away, just looked at me like she was deciding which version of this she wanted to use. Concerned, confused, reasonable. "I was worried," she said finally. "He deserves to know who he's marrying." There it was, clean, simple, controlled, exactly how I expected it. I nodded once, then I slid the envelope slightly closer to her. "Then you should probably read what you tried to leave out." That got her attention. She looked down at it this time, but still didn't open it. My father leaned forward slightly, like he was about to step in. "Juliet," he said, low, controlled, "this isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," I cut in. Not louder, just firmer. The room had gone quiet now, not completely silent, but enough that people weren't pretending not to listen anymore. Callum had stopped a few steps behind me. I could feel him there, waiting. I looked back at my mother. "Go ahead," I said. And this time, I didn't sound like someone asking to be heard. I sounded like someone who already had been. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she reached for the envelope, and as soon as her fingers touched it, I knew whatever happened next wasn't going to stay contained to this table. Have you ever watched someone realize they're out of control of the story? My mother opened the envelope slowly, not nervous, careful. Like if she moved at the right pace, she could still manage how this unfolded. She pulled the papers out one by one, didn't rush, didn't react at first, but I was watching her face. Not the way she wanted people to see it, the small changes she couldn't hide. Her eyes paused, just slightly, on the hospital records. Then again on the next page, longer this time, the messages. That's where it broke. Not loudly, not in a way anyone across the room would immediately notice, but I saw it. That moment where someone realizes the version they built doesn't hold anymore. My father leaned closer. "What is it?" he asked under his breath. She didn't answer. She just handed him the papers. That was new. My mother doesn't hand things over unless she has to. He scanned the first page quickly, then the next. His jaw tightened. Still controlled, still trying to keep it contained. But the room was already paying attention. You could feel it. That shift when people stop pretending they're not watching. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. For once, I wasn't the one explaining. Callum stepped closer beside me, not in front, not taking over, just there. He didn't ask what was in the envelope. He just looked at them, at my parents, like he was waiting for them to say something that made sense. They didn't. My father cleared his throat. "This doesn't change what we told him," he said quietly. That almost surprised me. Not because of what he said, but because he still thought he could say it. I looked at him. "Read it again," I said. Still calm, still steady. He didn't. Instead, he set the papers down like they were something temporary, like they didn't matter as much as the version he had already decided to stand by. My mother finally spoke again. "We were trying to protect him," she said. There it was, the justification, the same one, every time. Concern dressed up as control. I felt something settle in me then, not anger, not even hurt, just clarity. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And they were still choosing it. I glanced at Callum just for a second, and I saw it in his face. That shift, not doubt, something else, something heavier. Because now he wasn't looking at me differently. He was looking at them. And that changed everything. I turned back to my parents, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was standing in their version of the story. I felt like I was outside of it, and they were the ones trying to hold it together. But the room had already seen enough, and what came next wasn't going to be quiet anymore. Have you ever watched a room turn without anyone raising their voice? It started small. A chair shifting. Someone setting a glass down a little too carefully. A conversation that didn't pick back up. People weren't just listening anymore. They were choosing sides. Not out loud, but you could feel it in the way their attention moved away from me and toward my parents. That didn't happen often. My father noticed it too. You could see it in the way he straightened slightly, like he was about to take control of the room the way he always did. "All right," he said, just loud enough. "This has gone far enough." There it was, the reset, the attempt to close it, to make it seem like this was unnecessary, overblown, something that needed to be handled privately, where it could be reshaped again. But this time, it didn't land the same. No one moved. No one agreed. That silence stayed right where it was. He looked around expecting something. Support, maybe. It didn't come. My mother tried next. Softer tone. Controlled concern. "Juliet," she said, "we can talk about this later. This isn't the time." That almost would have worked. It sounded reasonable. It always did. I shook my head. "No," I said. Not louder, just clear. "This is exactly when we talk about it." Because for once, the room was hearing everything. Not just their version. Not just the parts that were easy to believe. All of it. Callum stepped forward then. Not between us. Just into it. And that mattered. Because this wasn't something he was watching anymore. This was something he was part of. He looked at my father first. "What exactly did you tell me?" he asked. Simple question, but the kind that leaves no room to move around it. My father didn't answer right away. That was the first crack, because he always had an answer. Always. But now, there were too many versions in the room. My mother tried to step in again. "We told you what we believed to be true." "No," Callum said, cutting her off, still calm, still controlled. "But that's not what I asked." That landed, not hard, but clean. And for the first time, I saw something I hadn't expected. My parents didn't look in control anymore. They looked exposed, because this wasn't a conversation they could guide, not with the proof sitting on the table, not with everyone watching, and not with Callum standing there, no longer trying to figure out who I was, but starting to understand who they were. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. For years, I had been the one trying to explain myself in rooms like this, trying to catch up to decisions that had already been made. But this time, I wasn't the one being questioned. And the longer that silence stretched, the clearer it became. They didn't have a version left that could survive it. Have you ever reached a point where you stop waiting for someone to do the right thing? That's where I was. The silence had stretched long enough that it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was clear. My father looked at Callum, then at the table, then back at the papers like they might rearrange themselves if he gave it a second. They didn't. My mother finally exhaled, small, controlled, and tried one more time. "We were concerned," she said. "We didn't want him walking into something without knowing everything." It sounded reasonable. It always did. But this time, it didn't land. Because now everyone knew what everything meant. Half-truths, missing pieces, a story shaped just enough to point in one direction. Callum didn't raise his voice. He didn't step closer. He just stood there and asked, "So, you knew that's not what happened? Not aggressive, not emotional, just direct." My mother didn't answer. That was the answer. My father tried to step in again. "We were trying to protect him," he said. Same line, different moment. It didn't hold this time either. Callum nodded once, slow, like something had just settled for him. "From what?" he asked. That question didn't have anywhere to go, and everyone in the room knew it. My mother looked down at her hands. My father didn't respond. And just like that, it was over. Not the situation, not the tension, but the version they had been holding on to. It didn't collapse all at once. It just stopped being believable. I felt something shift in me then. Not relief, not even satisfaction, just a kind of quiet distance. Like I was finally standing outside something I had spent years trying to get through. I reached forward, picked up the envelope, and held it for a second before setting it back down. Not because I needed it anymore, but because they did. Because that was the difference now. I wasn't trying to prove anything. They were. Callum turned slightly toward me. Not fully, just enough that I could see his expression clearly. And for the first time since that phone call, there was no hesitation in it. That mattered more than anything that had just been said. I looked back at my parents. They didn't look at me. And I realized something then that should have been obvious a long time ago. They weren't sorry. They were finished. Finished trying to explain it. Finished trying to adjust it. Finished because there was nothing left to work with. And in that moment, I stopped expecting anything from them. Not an apology, not an explanation, nothing. Because sometimes the closest thing you get to the truth is watching someone run out of ways to avoid it. And once you see that, you don't go back to who you were before. Not in that room, not in that life, not anymore. Have you ever thought something would break you and then realized it didn't have that power anymore? No one said anything for a moment after that. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because there was nothing left to fix. My father leaned back in his chair like he was done with the conversation. My mother stayed still, eyes down, hands folded like she was holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. I looked at them both and felt nothing I expected to feel. No anger, no need to argue, just distance, the kind you don't have to force. "I think you should go," I said. Calm, clear, not loud. My father looked up at that like he wasn't sure he heard me right. "This isn't your decision," he said. "It used to be. For a long time it was, but not anymore." "It is tonight," I said. No hesitation, no explanation. Just the boundary. My mother stood first, slow, controlled, still trying to keep something of the moment intact. My father followed a second later. Neither of them apologized. They didn't look at me when they left, and for the first time in my life, I didn't wait for them to. The door closed behind them, and the room stayed quiet for a second longer. Then something unexpected happened. Callum's mother, who'd been sitting halfway down the table the entire time, stood up. She looked at me, really looked at me, and then she started clapping. Slow at first, not dramatic, not loud, just deliberate. One person, then another, and then the whole room joined in, not because it was a performance, not because it was planned, but because everyone in that room had just seen something real, and they knew it. I stood there, not moving, just letting it happen, letting that sound replace every moment I had spent trying to be heard in rooms where no one listened. Callum stepped closer and took my hand, not to steady me, just to be there. And this time, there was no pause in him, no space, no doubt, just certainty. We got married the next day, small ceremony, close people, nothing exaggerated, just honest. My parents weren't there, and that wasn't a loss. That was a decision. Callum cried during his vows. I waited until he finished, and then I did too. Nora sat in the front row, same quiet presence, same steady kind of support. Some things don't need to be explained to matter. My name is Juliet Carter. I'm 28 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I had to earn the right to be believed. I don't think that anymore, because the truth doesn't get stronger when people accept it. It just stays true. And sometimes, the moment everything falls apart is the exact moment your life finally starts to make sense. If you've ever had someone tell your story for you and everyone believed them, just know this: that's not where it ends. Sometimes, that's where it finally begins.